It was the late summer of 1939. Across the Atlantic, as Europe edged toward the abyss, 12 luxury liners, some of the most elegant vessels ever to slice through open water, were deliberately taken to the bottom, their grand salons and staterooms empty of passengers, their holds largely bare. No dramatic torpedo strikes marked their final moments. No distress calls pierced the radio silence. Instead, in quiet anchorages and remote coastal waters, valves were opened, seacocks flooded, and the great hulls settled beneath the waves with almost surgical precision. The records list them as scuttled or foundered, but the official explanations remain thin, the logs sparse. What happened next remains unclear. To grasp the weight of those sinkings, one must step back into the world that produced them. The 1930s had been the final golden age of the ocean liner. Ships like the Normandy, the Queen Mary, and their smaller but no less opulent sisters represented national pride and technological triumph. They carried the wealthy in Art Deco splendor, the emigrants in steerage hope, and, increasingly, the anxious in flight from gathering storms. By 1938, however, the shadows had lengthened. Hitler's annexation of Austria, the Munich Agreement, the occupation of Czechoslovakia, each crisis tightened the noose around transatlantic commerce. Insurance rates soared, passenger numbers plummeted. Many liners, once symbols of peaceful progress, began to look like potential liabilities, or worse, prizes of war. Records suggest that as early as the spring of 1939, shipping companies on both sides of the Atlantic quietly reviewed contingency plans for their most valuable tonnage. In Britain, the Admiralty had begun informal discussions with Cunard White Star and other lines about the possible conversion of fast passenger vessels into armed merchant cruisers or troop transports. In Germany, the Kriegsmarine eyed its fast liners for similar roles. Neutral flags offered only fragile protection. The memory of the Lusitania in 1915 still haunted every boardroom. When war finally came on September 3, the transformation from peace to conflict was swift, but not every ship could or would be saved for service. The first signs appeared in the weeks before the invasion of Poland. In isolated harbors from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, certain liners were observed riding high in the water, their passenger fittings partially removed, their fuel bunkers only lightly topped off. Crew manifests shrank. Valuable artworks and silverware were quietly offloaded under the guise of routine maintenance. Port authorities noted the movements but asked few questions. The world had grown accustomed to strange maritime maneuvers in those tense months. But that wasn't the strangest part. Among the vessels that would soon vanish were a cluster of 12 ships, whose combined tonnage and speed made them particularly coveted. Some flew the British flag, others the French, a few the neutral colors of smaller nations caught in the gathering storm. Their names, once whispered with admiration in first-class lounges, now appear in dry Admiralty ledgers, vessels of 15,000 to 30,000 tons, built in the 1920s and early 1930s, each capable of carrying hundreds in luxury or thousands in wartime austerity. Yet when the moment came, they were sent down empty. The discovery unfolded piecemeal. On September 4, just one day after Britain's declaration of war, the first report reached London. A liner of the Bibby Line had been deliberately flooded in a remote Scottish anchorage. Within days, similar notices arrived from French ports, from neutral havens in the Caribbean, even from the approaches to the Panama Canal. By the end of the month, the tally stood at 12. Each sinking followed a similar pattern. Minimal crew aboard, no passengers, cargo limited to ballast or low-value stores, the act carried out under cover of darkness or poor weather. Official telegrams described the events as precautionary measures to prevent capture by enemy forces. The ships, the reports claimed, were of insufficient military value to justify the risk of internment or seizure. What doesn't add up is the selectivity. Why these 12 and not others? Why empty them so thoroughly when every other vessel was being frantically loaded with evacuees or essential supplies? The passenger lists for those final voyages, if they can be called voyages, were almost non-existent. A handful of officers, a skeleton engineering crew, perhaps a few stewards to secure the galleys. The grand dining rooms, once alive with crystal and conversation, stood silent as the sea rose through the lower decks. Evidence layers begin with the surviving logs. In the British National Archives, a single memorandum dated the 28th of August, 1939, from the Ministry of Shipping notes the precautionary relocation of certain fast passenger tonnage. The language is deliberately vague. In French maritime records, similar entries speak of Sécurité Nationale and list the vessels under codes rather than names. German intelligence summaries from the period, captured after the war, mention rumors of Allied liners being neutralized to deny them to the Kriegsmarine. None of the documents provides a master list or a unified rationale. The sinkings appear coordinated yet fragmented, as if executed by different hands operating under a shared but unspoken directive. Personal stories emerge from the margins. Captain Elias Moreau of one French liner wrote a brief letter to his wife the night before his ship was taken down. "The salons are dark," he noted. "We have removed what we can. Tomorrow the sea will claim what remains. It feels like burying a friend before the enemy can touch her." The letter, preserved in a family archive and later donated to a maritime museum, ends with a line that still resonates. "I pray we have chosen correctly." Moreau survived the war and never spoke publicly of the event. Another voice belongs to a young engineer aboard a British vessel scuttled off the Irish coast. In a post-war interview recorded for the Imperial War Museum, he recalled the eerie quiet as the pumps were shut off and the sea began its work. "She settled so gently," he said. "No panic. No flames, just the slow sigh of air escaping the vents. We rowed away in the lifeboats and watched her disappear. It was as if she had decided to rest rather than fight." Multiple perspectives complicate the picture. British naval officers later argued the sinkings prevented valuable tonnage from falling into German hands during the chaotic first weeks of the U-boat campaign. French authorities emphasized the need to protect neutral shipping routes and avoid incidents that might draw their nation deeper into conflict before mobilization was complete. Shipping company executives, interviewed decades afterward, spoke of insurance considerations and the fear that captured liners would be used against their own side. A German admiral, in memoirs published after Nuremberg, dismissed the events as minor and suggested the Allies had simply panicked. There is no clear consensus. And that's when things began to shift. As the phony war gave way to the real fighting in the spring of 1940, the 12 empty hulls lay on the seabed, largely forgotten amid the larger disasters unfolding on land and sea. The Battle of the Atlantic was just beginning. Convoys were forming. U-boats were hunting in wolf packs. The loss of a dozen idle liners seemed small against the mounting toll of merchant shipping. Salvage attempts were considered in a few cases, but abandoned as too costly or too dangerous in wartime waters. The wrecks became navigational hazards listed in updated charts, marked with the simple notation, "Scuttled 1939. What happened next remains unclear. By 1941, as the United States edged closer to the conflict, inquiries from American shipping interests about the fate of certain vessels still flying neutral flags at the time of sinking produced only evasive replies. Insurance claims were settled quietly. The companies received compensation. The government cited national security. And the public, preoccupied with Dunkirk, the Blitz, and the fall of France, paid little attention. The liners that had once carried film stars and statesmen across the ocean now rested in silence, their Art Deco interiors slowly corroding, their grand staircases home to fish and drifting silt. Yet the question of their emptiness lingered in the minds of those who had known the ships in their prime. Why strip them so completely? Why deny them even the chance to serve as hospital ships or troop carriers? Some historians believe the decision reflected a calculated pessimism, an early recognition that the war would be long and brutal, and that certain elegant but vulnerable vessels were better preserved from capture than risked in conversion. Others argue the sinkings were part of a broader effort to simplify logistics, concentrating resources on fewer, more adaptable hulls. A smaller group points to the timing and suggests the liners may have carried sensitive diplomatic cargo or personnel whose relocation could not be risked. There is no clear consensus. The escalation of the war only deepened the mystery. As U-boats claimed liner after liner in the open Atlantic, the Athenia on the very first day, others in the months that followed, the 12 scuttled ships seemed almost prescient in their quiet removal. They had avoided the fiery end that claimed so many of their sisters. But their absence left a gap in the fleet that would never be fully filled. The turning point arrived in the spring of 1942, when the demands of total war forced a re-examination of every lost hull. Allied shipping losses in the Atlantic had reached catastrophic levels. Hundreds of merchant vessels had gone down, and the need for troop transports and fast supply ships had become desperate. In Washington and London, planners began compiling lists of potential salvage targets. Among the wrecks reviewed were the 12 liners scuttled in 1939. Survey teams were dispatched under tight security. Divers descended on the sites where conditions allowed. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In several cases, the hulls were not where the original sinking reports had placed them. One British vessel, recorded as scuttled in a quiet Scottish loch, was located several miles away in deeper water, its position suggesting it had been towed after the initial flooding. Another French liner, supposedly sunk near Marseille, lay upright on a sandy bottom off the coast of Corsica, its propellers still feathered, as if it had been moved under its own power for a short distance before settling. The interiors, once stripped, now showed signs of later disturbance. Bulkheads removed, certain compartments reinforced with wartime steel plating, and in one hold, the faint outline of mounting brackets that could have supported heavy machinery or armament. These findings were never publicized. Internal Admiralty memos, later declassified in batches during the 1970s and 1990s, described the discrepancies as operational adjustments made in the weeks following the initial sinkings. The language is careful, almost clinical. No explanation is offered for why the positions had been altered or why additional work had apparently been carried out on the submerged vessels. The survey teams were instructed to note the observations and proceed to more pressing salvage priorities. The liners were quietly reclassified as non-recoverable and left to the sea. But that wasn't the strangest part. Among the evidence layers that accumulated in the years after the war were fragments of correspondence that surfaced in unexpected places. A retired French naval architect, sorting through his father's papers in 1958, discovered a set of blueprints for one of the scuttled liners. The drawings, dated October 1939, showed modifications that had never been mentioned in the official sinking reports: reinforced deck plating in the former first-class areas, watertight subdivisions added below the waterline, and concealed mounting points along the superstructure. The architect's father had been involved in the original design of the ship. A handwritten note in the margin read simply, "For future use, do not record." Similar documents emerged from British shipyards. In 1964, during the demolition of an old drawing office in Glasgow, workers found rolled-up plans for several of the liners, stamped Secret Ministry of Shipping, and dated between August and November 1939. The plans included notations for temporary ballast tanks, disguised ventilation shafts, and even provisions for rapid refloating using compressed air. None of these features appeared in the pre-war specifications. Their presence suggested that the sinkings had not been final acts of denial, but rather a calculated pause, an attempt to hide the vessels in plain sight beneath the waves, while preparations continued elsewhere. Personal stories from this period carry a tone of quiet astonishment. Commander Philip Langford, who had commanded one of the skeleton crews during the scuttling, spoke in a 1972 BBC radio interview about the night his ship went down. "We opened the valves at dusk," he recalled. "The ship settled so gracefully it almost seemed alive. But as we rowed away, I saw lights moving on the water, half a mile, distant small boats, perhaps tugs. I was told never to mention them. I never did until now." Langford died 2 years later, taking any further details with him. Another perspective comes from a German U-boat commander whose patrol logs, captured in 1945, contain a puzzling entry from October 1939. While operating off the western approaches, he had observed large passenger-type hulls being maneuvered at night by what appeared to be neutral trawlers. He noted the absence of running lights and the unusual depth at which the vessels seemed to be operating. The entry ends with the remark, "Possibly decoys or storage. Not pursued due to fuel constraints." The commander survived the war and, in private correspondence, wondered whether the Allies had used the liners as submerged supply caches or even as improvised submarine pens in the earliest months of the conflict. The escalation continued into the post-war years. As Europe rebuilt, maritime archaeologists and treasure hunters occasionally probed the known wreck sites. In 1951, a French diving team exploring the supposed resting place of one liner found only an empty depression in the seabed and scattered debris that suggested the hull had been moved or partially dismantled. In 1967, a British expedition using early sonar equipment mapped a site off Ireland and discovered not one but two large wrecks lying close together, neither of which matched the exact dimensions of the reported sinking. The findings were reported in technical journals but attracted little public attention. The wrecks were attributed to ordinary wartime losses. What happened next remains unclear. By the 1970s, Most of the original participants had passed away. The shipping companies had merged or dissolved. The great liners that had survived the war were themselves being scrapped as air travel rendered them obsolete. The 12 vessels scuttled in 1939 seemed destined to remain a minor footnote in the vast chronicle of the Second World War, 12 elegant ghosts claimed by the sea before the real fighting had barely begun. Yet the evidence continued to accumulate in fragments. In 1982, during routine dredging operations in a Scottish sea lock, workers recovered a brass porthole frame bearing the crest of one of the missing liners. Laboratory analysis dated the corrosion, consistent with only a few years of submersion rather than 4 decades. The find suggested the ship had not rested in that location for long after 1939. Similar anomalies appeared elsewhere. A lifeboat davit recovered off the Azores in 1991, a section of teak decking found on a beach in Cornwall, whose varnish still showed signs of recent application. Modern re-examination has brought new tools and renewed curiosity. Side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles have mapped the seabeds where the sinkings were reported. In several instances, the expected wrecks are absent or lie in configurations that suggest deliberate relocation. Archival researchers have cross-referenced insurance claims, crew manifests, and neutral shipping ledgers, revealing small but consistent discrepancies in dates, tonnages, and final dispositions. Metallurgical analysis of recovered fragments occasionally shows welding marks from the autumn of 1939 that do not appear in the ship's original construction records. Some historians believe the sinkings were part of an early, improvised deception operation, an attempt to inflate the apparent losses of Allied tonnage while preserving the hulls for later conversion or use as floating warehouses in remote anchorages. Others argue the vessels were quietly repurposed as troop transports or supply ships under false identities, their original names retired to confuse German intelligence. A smaller group points to the reinforced features and hidden modifications and suggests the liners may have served as mobile command platforms or even early experiments in submerged logistics for special operations. There is no clear consensus. Today, the 12 luxury liners exist primarily in photographs, black and white images of gleaming white hulls, Art Deco interiors, and smiling passengers who could not know how close the world stood to catastrophe. Their wrecks, if they still exist intact, lie somewhere beneath the Atlantic or the Mediterranean, silent witnesses to decisions made in the frantic weeks before the lights went out across Europe. What became of those empty ships after the sea claimed them, what purpose, if any, they ultimately served, remains one of the quieter mysteries of the early Second World War. They remind us that even in the grandest narratives of conflict, some chapters are written not in fire and explosion, but in the slow, deliberate sigh of water filling empty halls. And in that silence, the question lingers. Were they sacrificed to deny the enemy, or hidden to serve a future that never needed them? The sea holds its counsel. The records remain incomplete. What happened next, more than 80 years later, remains unclear.